All right, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started again. Our second panel of the day is Global Animal Aquaculture Law. We are going to go until 12:25 so that we have ample time for this discussion. I'd like to turn it over to my colleague at Lewis and Clark Law School, Hira Jaleel, who is a visiting assistant professor with us, and also, I'm proud to say, an animal law LLM alum of our program.
Thank you. Can everyone hear? Okay, this is working. All right. So welcome back from the break, everyone. So as Megan said, I'm Hira Jaleel. I'm a visiting assistant professor at the Center for Animal Law Studies, and I'm really psyched to be here introducing our wonderful panelists for this session. So this panel is going to provide an overview of global aquaculture law and policy. We're trying to represent as many global regions as possible, although of course it's impossible to cover all the aquaculture law and policy around the world in one panel. So we'll be doing very short 5 to 7 minute presentations each, followed by a discussion, a moderated Q&A, and then we'll turn it over to the audience for questions. So I would like to start by introducing our panelists. Paula Cardoso is General Counsel at Mercy for Animals. She is co-chair of the International Animal Law Committee of the American Bar Association and LATAM General Counsel for Mercy for Animals. She joined the organization in 2017 and in 2022 created MFA's Strategic Litigation Program in Brazil. Alice Concetto, Executive Director of the European Institute for Animal Law and Policy and Chief Legal Advisor at the European Institute for Animal Law and Policy. Alice is also a lecturer in EU Animal Law and Ethics at Sciences Po in Paris, France. Esan is a PhD researcher in animal law at the University of Birmingham, right here, funded by the Midlands for Cities Doctoral Training Partnership. Mo conducts research on African animal law, particularly the Animal Welfare Strategy for Africa and Third World Approaches to International Law, Decolonial Theory, and Critical Animal Studies. And last but not the least, we have Rhiddhi Patel, who is a policy specialist at the Fish Welfare Initiative. She's a policy consultant from India, specializing in aquaculture law, policy, and fish welfare. She holds a degree in law and a postgraduate diploma in animal protection laws. Her work focuses on integrating fish welfare considerations into policy, and she's contributed to the development of policies and national standards that incorporate welfare into aquaculture management. So please give a round of applause to our wonderful panelists. And without further ado, Paula, I will turn it over to you to kick us off.
Thank you. Should we do the sitting or should we stand up? Okay, I'll just stay here. So, hi everyone, it's a pleasure to be here. And before we start talking about aquaculture, I do want to address something because I don't know if I'm going to have the opportunity to thank Hira in public ever again. So I just want to say that it is so beautiful to see Hira's work and how she makes room for other women from the global majority. So thank you so much, Hira, for doing that. You're a superstar. And I think that this panel, the diversity of this panel speaks for itself, right? So back to our main topic here. I'm going to be talking about Brazil and how fast Brazilian aquaculture industry is expanding. My point is fairly simple. Brazil is expanding its legal framework, its legal infrastructure for the rapid growth of aquaculture, but unfortunately it is expanding faster. This legal framework is expanding faster than the legal framework for the protection of those animals. And I do think that this is true in other regions as well, but since I'm talking about Brazil, that's what I'm going to be focusing on. How do I go to the next? Yeah, there you go. So Brazil has one of the world's largest water reserves in the world. Around 13% of the water reserves in the world are in Brazil. So we do have this abundant freshwater and coastal resources or sources, not going to talk in terms of resources, no. And modern aquaculture started in the 70s, so it's a fairly new industry in the country. So it is quite scary how fast it is growing, right? And in 2024, our farmed fish production was around almost 140,000 tons. So this is a lot, and almost 20% more than in the previous year compared to 2023. And it's a highly concentrated sector as well. Most of our production is tilapia production, and it's these facilities are mostly located in federal waters, or what we call it, waters under federal domain. So as I said, tilapia is more than 99% of all aquatic animals farmed in Brazil. And most of this production is intensive net cage systems. The problems around those systems have been very well explored in the previous panel, so I'm not going to go too deep into that. But I do want to highlight that escape is a particularly problematic matter in Brazil, because tilapia is not native for us. So we do have the cross-species problem to deal with. So if tilapia escapes from the farms, it can not only procreate in that environment, but also have problems with other species, right? So this is one problem we need to address. I did use pictures from the industry, so I don't want to romanticize what is in those pictures. I know that animal lovers do see suffering in those pictures as well, but I just want you to know that these pictures were from a photographer that works in the industry. So there is a legal paradox that I'm sure that is a bit more particular to Brazil than it is in other countries, because our constitution bans animal cruelty, and it does not, it is a constitutional principle applicable to all species. So unlike other places, not only we have the constitutional protection, but this constitutional protection is applicable to companion animals, wild animals, and farmed animals, in theory, of course. But and there is a contrast between what the Constitution says and the civil law, because civil law, and when I say civil law, I mean civil code and civil legislation, not civil law as a system. So our civil law, our civil legislation still treats animals as property. So you do see the paradox there, right? So we do have this constitutional principle that says all animals should be protected, but if they are property, we're never going to be able to protect them properly. And that is true for fish as well, for any aquatic animal as well. So the sector, this sector is regulated as with production focus legislation and not animal welfare legislation, right? Which is also true in other in other jurisdictions as well. And that creates gaps in our system. So we do have. I can talk more about the welfare gaps in our legislation, but I just want to address these main three ones, which is we do have one piece of legislation, which is this Ordinance 365 that talks about humane slaughter. And when we say humane slaughter, I mean stunning before killing, right? I'm not going to use the humane term because I don't think that stunning before killing is actually humane, but it is like a very basic, it's common sense almost, that that's the least you can do for an animal. It's stunning before killing if you're gonna slaughter that individual. So even though the Constitution is applicable to all animals, the stunning before killing norm is not applicable to all animals. So aquatic animals are not protected or are not given, not even this one protection, which is being stunned before killing. Most of them die from suffocation. And I learned recently from one of our undercover investigations that putting the animals on ice is not what actually kills them. It actually makes their death slower, so they suffocate slower. And that is standard practice, right? This isn't standard practice in this industry. So once you get fish out of the water, you put them directly on ice so that their flesh stays fresh. And that doesn't kill them. It actually makes their breathing slower, and then they suffocate slower. So not only they are not stunned before killing, they are not stunned before being put on ice. And so this ordinance that would be applicable to all other farmed animals is not applicable to them. And going to conclude my presentation, I think there are some reforms, incremental progress that we can make. And as Dana mentioned in her talk, we should be working towards reforms as well. So include fish in the stunning before killing norm would be a progress. Ban what they call ice slurry would be improvement for sure, so that they don't suffocate slowly. And also thinking about density, water quality tied to animal welfare, not just water quality from an environmental perspective, but tying water quality regulation to animal welfare, and also for farm fish, creating enrichment standards that should be implemented by aquaculture settings would be, I think would be very beneficial for the individuals, not for ending animal exploitation for sure, but it would be beneficial from an individual perspective. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Paula. And Mo, you're next.
Okay. Hey. I've never used mics like this before. I like them. Okay. Hi. My name is Mo, and I'm going to be presenting on Nigeria's aquaculture law and policy landscape. And now, I think what's interesting about this presentation before I get into it is how little there is to say. And it is a good thing for me because it means I don't have to do too much. But on the second hand, I think what it shows is a big problem, because I don't think it's in 2026 that someone should start talking about something as important as this. But I think this is common to many jurisdictions, really. The aquaculture law is really, really sparse. And what we can draw from the existing frameworks that are more general in terms of like environmental protection or sanitation, or even broader stuff like sustainability and climate change, and of course the cruelty acts that we have in Nigeria. But I'm going to be looking at the state of aquaculture in Nigeria, commonly farmed species, common aquaculture systems, and key legislation. Now, looking at what aquaculture is in Nigeria, I think from a personal perspective, before I go into the real data, from a personal perspective, a number of people, it is really common that many people have their own ponds in their houses. Production is not large scale. I don't know of one major aquaculture plant that serves the country or serves the community, many people are very personal about it. And I kind of see that as an opportunity because it means that while, lack of regulation is the biggest problem of that, but it also shows that it's not so large scale, which means that it hasn't been polluted in a way that may be difficult to control. I think in Nigeria it would be easier to control individuals that have ponds in their homes than it would be to have if there was like a factory farm for fish. Right, but the aquaculture conversation in Nigeria cannot be looked at as just aquaculture. A lot of it is linked to sustainable livelihoods. A lot of it is linked to nutrition, to culture, which are very complex topics. I find that when we have such discussions, it's very easy to rule out the role that culture plays in things like this. And I think that's something that's very important to highlight, especially when talking about a context like that of Nigeria. As I said, many people, I remember my grandfather before he passed, he took a lot of pride in the fish pond he had at the back of his house. He had like 5 fish. It wasn't like it was so huge, but it was something that everybody who visited had to see. It didn't matter who you were. He'd be like, oh, I have a fish pond now. I think it was part of his retirement joys. And that is something he tried to pass on to my dad, which my dad rejected. But a number of families have that same culture because you inherit the house and then the house has that pond already. And so you just think it's not too expensive to continue something like this, especially if it feeds your home. And another thing to really highlight about aquaculture in Nigeria is fish is one of the most affordable options. In many contexts, it's seen as a cheaper form of food. So you find it as, and because there's a lot of lakes and rivers as well, people fish. It's not regulated at all. And as I said, I think this is an advantage. So the current landscape in terms of what the government is trying to promote in Nigeria actually largely has to do with encouraging people to engage in personal fish farming more because there's a huge gap. There is more people need fish than there's fish in Nigeria. And so what we find is some subsidies for like fish feed because it's not difficult at all. There's nothing you need to do to start a fish pond in your house apart from get a bricklayer to construct something and have water supply. So this small-scale farming gives room for the regulation to have some form of effect. But the issue is that the regulation is more national, is more on a big scale and has more to do with imports and exports, which creates a problem. I don't know why this isn't working, and now I've lost track of the next slide. Okay.
There you go.
There I
that
go.
went too
Okay.
far.
Okay. So yeah, the commonly farmed species in Nigeria are the African catfish, and I understand this to be like some. It's the regular catfish, but it has been, to use this word, Nigerianized, because I haven't seen it anywhere else. It's really dark. They can be really huge, but they can also be really small. But this is the cheapest, not the cheapest, but the most common form of fish. And this is what everybody, by everybody I mean largely, fishes. Tilapia, on the other hand, is like a higher scale. So it's also more difficult to farm at the back of your house. So usually these ones are like small-scale businesses, once again, unrelated. And then we have carp. Carp is not so popular. And then we have catfish hybrids. And it was in the course of thinking I realized I removed mackerel and Titus fishes, which is what we call them in Nigeria. I think they're called differently here. But those are pretty popular in terms of thinking about what we think when we say fish in Nigeria, because seafood, on the other hand, is very luxury. It's not something that I think a number of people even know about. So, and I think that's also positive because it means like it's not such a wide range of aquaculture that we're dealing with in Nigeria when talking about the landscape. So when we think about change, it's very likely that we can have targeted initiatives that can actually hit the specific species that are being affected in Nigeria. The common aquaculture systems are earthen ponds, which is what is popular in people's homes, and concrete tanks. And then there are cages, there are pens, and integrated fish farming systems. Now, what I found in my experience is people tend to, especially the elite tend to lean towards the integrated farming systems because of how they advertise. Now, the food labeling in Nigeria is a whole different discussion. But for example, there are some vegan labeling that is not actually vegan. that's one of the big problems that we have, is even looking at the general concepts, dictionary definition concepts that are understood very, wow, time goes so quickly. Wow, I'm lost. Okay, that are understood very differently in Nigeria. But the point is, people have a lot of attraction to all these small-scale systems, small-scale farmings, and I think this discussion is important because it shows how different landscapes are and how we need to have targeted initiatives in terms of improving their welfare. So the key legislation I want to speak about really is the first two on this slide, the Inland Fisheries Act and the Sea Fisheries Act. Now, these are really, really old laws, to be honest, but they have some provisions on animal welfare, and I'm so proud that I found this out because I don't think anybody has, which is kind of cool. But under the Inland Fisheries Act, it bans any person from catching fish by certain ways, and I think I have this also in the slide, but to be fast, electrocution is banned. There are different methods. Trying to find it. You can't destroy a fish within some certain waters, and it's not just territorial waters as is popular, like even some certain lakes are protected. And I don't think anybody knows I don't even think the lawmakers know about this, which is really interesting, because then I can share this presentation. But the point is, it does seem like in our black letter law, we have some form of care, to use the word care loosely, really, but we have some form of care for animals because there's some substances, there's a list of them, I really can't pronounce some of the substances, but under the Inland Fisheries Act, these substances are banned from being used on animals and electrocution and things like that, which is important because at least it gives a leeway for the regulation of this industry. Because I know that one of the ways the most popular method to unalive a fish would be like just handheld and using like a sharp instrument or something like that. But when thinking of scale and a way to curb fish farming from increasing or becoming larger scale in Nigeria, I think these laws become important. It's first two especially, which are the only two that actually have something to do with the method of, killing the fish. And I think it's a good place to start, especially because the legislation is so fragmented, right? So because of this fragmentation, I think, at least in terms of expansion, which is where I think the aquaculture policy landscape in Nigeria is important, is in curbing expansion. I think that would be my recommendation. And I think we already have legislation for that, which puts us maybe about a couple steps ahead. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mo. That was a really interesting perspective. I had no idea. I also had no idea about Brazil. Okay, so I am going to talk about, if my slides are, I think you have to point it towards Hira. Okay, so I'm going to talk about US aquaculture law and policy, and I'm going to do a really, really high-level overview of US law because there's a lot of law. Aquaculture actually, depending on who you ask, is either over-regulated or severely under-regulated in the US. If you ask me, I do think it's under-regulated because, of course, animals don't receive protection. But that doesn't mean a lot of protection, but that doesn't mean that there aren't any laws that govern the industry as a whole. So just a snapshot of US aquaculture. It's a relatively small, for the size of the country, domestic production sector. So the USDA reports about $1.9 billion in US aquaculture sales in 2023, and that's all of this is coming from about 3,500 farms. However, about 75 to 90% of US seafood as a whole consumption is basically coming from imports, right? So the country is very dependent on seafood imports, and that's not something that the government, and specifically this administration, is very happy about. And so the push towards aquaculture is really kind of coming from the impetus behind aquaculture expansion is really that the US is very dependent on imports and doesn't want to be very dependent on imports. And of course, like I think this is a common theme across many other countries as well, that this narrative of like growing the industry and growing the field is really miles ahead of the protections offered to animals. So like the growth in animal welfare or protection law is really not keeping up with the push to expand aquaculture, which, like as we heard in our last panel, is not the best thing. So in terms of species and systems, it's very diverse, as is all animal aquaculture. So freshwater aquaculture, we're principally talking catfish, crawfish, and trout. Marine shellfish includes oysters, clams, and mussels. And marine finfish is still a smaller part of the domestic production, but the push to expand marine offshore aquaculture in federal waters specifically, that is mostly focusing on finfish. And when we're talking about marine offshore aquaculture in federal waters, we're also talking about waters that are beyond state territorial waters. So we're talking way out in the ocean, where we talked about in our last panel, there's even less visibility of what's going on and what's actually happening to the animals. The production systems are similarly diverse. So we have ponds, raceways, recirculating systems, and again, this push for net pens and cages. And we also have bottom and off-bottom mollusk culture. So all this to say, when we talk about animal protection or addressing the harms of aquaculture, it's really not as easy to think about it in a general way, because we're talking about many, many species, and we're talking about many, many ways in which those species are farmed. But to try and kind of break it down a little bit, at the promotional end, or when we talk about laws that are kind of, or executive orders that are more aspirational about what the government wants out of aquaculture, we have the National Aquaculture Act of 1980, which encourages aquaculture development, but it doesn't really create any kind of comprehensive welfare or permitting regime for the industry. And again, in the first Trump administration, and then also in the second Trump administration, we had some executive orders emphasizing the growth for the industry, asking agencies to take specific actions, emphasizing seafood competitiveness, and trying to basically create like a regulatory pathway for aquaculture expansion. All that to say that, of course, we did have the Biden administration between the first and second Trump administrations, and they didn't, and that work was continued during the Biden administration as well. So on the permitting side, we have different statutes that are kind of doing different things, and we've also had a lot of litigation around federal aquaculture, or this push to expand aquaculture in federal waters. So we have the Magnuson-Stevens Fishery Conservation and Management Act, which is, of course, our central federal fisheries law, and the National Marine Fisheries Service, which is the agency responsible for fisheries management, has tried to apply that law to aquaculture, or try to regulate aquaculture using that fisheries law. But, of course, like courts, thankfully, have said that a fisheries law is not designed to regulate aquaculture, and so that's not something the agency was able to do. We also, of course, have like laws that regulate the environment more generally, like the Clean Water Act that regulates discharges. It actually does already regulate discharges from concentrated aquatic animal production facilities. We also have the Rivers and Harbors Act, which regulates structures in navigable waters. So there's also been some litigation around that, which I'll talk about in a minute. We have the Endangered Species Act, the Marine Mammal Protection Act. So there's like an entire web of regulatory laws and policies that are governing aquaculture. And the industry is not happy about it at all. I saw a report just yesterday which basically was an industry report positing that there's just way too much regulation of aquaculture happening in the US right now. But importantly, for animal protection purposes, there is no general federal welfare regime that governs the farming, handling, transport, or slaughter of farmed aquatic animals. And this is not an anomaly, because no such federal regime really, there is a federal regime for terrestrial animal farming insofar as like humane handling and slaughter is concerned, but not really for on-farm treatment. So it tracks with that as well. So in terms of litigation and kind of what's happening in the marine offshore aquaculture space right now, because that is really where most of the litigation and like the changes in the law are happening. So I've already talked about how the Fifth Circuit has held in 2020 that the fisheries agency could not create a Gulf aquaculture regime using existing law, using existing fisheries law. However, under an executive order that was issued by the first Trump administration, NOAA has identified 13 aquaculture opportunity areas in 2025 across Southern California and the Gulf of Mexico. So that work is still, essentially the agency is trying to scope out and conduct environmental impact assessments for areas in federal waters where aquaculture could be expanded. Similarly, we had the US Army Corps of Engineers issue a general nationwide permit for offshore finfish structures, so basically authorizing the structures for aquaculture in federal waters. That litigation, thankfully, was also successful, like a challenge to that permit, and that permit was held to be unlawful because the environmental impact assessment only considered the environmental impact of the structures themselves and not of aquaculture as an activity. But concerningly, the USDA this year has established a new Office of Seafood, and the mandate of that office includes aquaculture. So again, showing that the government is at least the federal government is very, very interested in promoting and expanding the industry. And so I'm out of time, but just to very quickly conclude, the current gaps as I see them is really in kind of the welfare protection space. And those gaps are not, there are state laws that obviously will regulate, or some state anti-cruelty laws do cover fish or certain other aquatic animals. Again, just a law covering aquatic animals and a prosecutor actually prosecuting, like those are very different things. But having a law on the books is a good thing. However, that again, no such regime exists on the federal level, as well as I don't think it's going to be very easy for such a regime to exist as well. So we're going to need new legislation and ideally even a new agency, because again, if we're using the terrestrial animal agriculture example, if we're going off of that, then the model that currently works in that space is completely broken. So it's not going to work in the aquaculture space either. So yeah, that's all I had to say. And we will now move on to Rhiddhi.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk about the Indian aquaculture law and policy space and whether and how aquatic animals are protected under the framework. So the Indian aquaculture sector currently is expanding very rapidly, and we are currently the second largest aquaculture producer, and aquaculture contributes to about 75% of our total production of 18.4 million metric tons. The production environments and the species are also very diverse. We have freshwater aquaculture that is dominated by Indian major carps, catfish, pangasius. Pangasius is also a catfish, but I have written that separately because this is not a native species for India. We also have tilapia and murrels, and in brackish water we have shrimp. Shrimp dominates this sector. We have milkfish, mullets, crabs, and Asian sea bass. On the marine side, we have a lot of marine aquaculture facilities also coming up, and cobia, grouper, silver pompano are the species that are dominating here. We also have a very small niche growing, so to say, market for rainbow trouts in the Himalayan states, because there are cold water bodies in that area. And the production systems are also diverse. We have earthen ponds, which is the dominant production system. We also have tanks here, man-made tanks, and cage and pen aquaculture, raceway for trout production, and biofloc and RAS systems are also being popularized. So there's a lot of diversity in species. Culture practices from monoculture, polyculture, integrated aquaculture, and multi-tropic aquaculture as well, and different environments and production systems. So the regulation becomes quite challenging. And next, I want to talk about whether animal welfare is protected under animal law. And we have union or a federal legislation for animal welfare, and that is called the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act. So there are general provisions, and interestingly, the Act protects animals from unnecessary pain and suffering, including during food production. So this Act can act as guiding principles for aquaculture development policy. However, in practice, there are very limited or no aquatic animal protections under this law. And there are rules under this law which require transport of animals to be done with welfare in mind. And the Act also has slaughterhouse rules, but again, they do not cover aquatic animals at all. So who regulates aquaculture in India? So we have a federal system of government, and we have the union government that regulates coastal, that is brackish and saline water aquaculture throughout the country, irrespective of state boundaries. This is done through the Coastal Aquaculture Authority Act. We have various states. We have about 28 states and 8 union territories, and they all can regulate aquaculture within their state boundaries. So this could be licensing, farm management, oversight, penalties, etc. We also have a set of concurrent responsibilities which are shared by the union and the state, but the union law does supersede. There are instances where states have, for their sociocultural reasons, come up with amendments to certain areas of these laws, but largely it is the union law that supersedes. And these are basically related to animal welfare, environment impact, infectious and contagious diseases on animals, and food safety. So on the national regulatory framework, we have the Animal Welfare Protection Act, right? The Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act. And like I'd mentioned before, there are broad provisions. There are transport rules for animals, but this is mostly for terrestrial animals. And there are slaughterhouse rules as well. But again, no aquatic animals or species are covered under this law. There are 3 or 4 laws that regulate environment, and we have the Environment Protection Act and rules, and the Water Prevention and Control of Pollution Act. There are also industry-specific guidelines, but again, there are no aquaculture-specific guidelines for the environmental impact from aquaculture. And different industries like poultry industry and the dairy industry are covered by these guidelines, but there are no guidelines right now for aquaculture. The Diseases and Prevention, the Prevention and Control of Infectious Diseases in Animals Act interestingly lists crustacean and fish diseases, and there are reporting requirements. Farmers are supposed to report these diseases to their authorities, and there are some control mechanisms that kick in once these diseases are reported. And then there's the Food Safety Standards Authority of India, and they have a bunch of regulations, and animal welfare and humane slaughter explicitly exclude fish from meat markets. However, for terrestrial animals like poultry, pigs, sheep, etc., there are requirements for humane slaughter. And there are some transport and welfare provisions also in the food safety legal framework. And then we finally have the Coastal Aquaculture Authority Act. Here there is stronger water quality management and farm management standards, but these are, because it's coastal aquaculture, it's largely dominated by shrimp and export-oriented markets. On the subnational level, where we have the state regulatory framework, this varies significantly across states. So we have states that have more developed regulatory frameworks, like Andhra Pradesh and Kerala, where there is a requirement for licensing and registration of farms. There are seed and feed quality control acts, and there are some enforcement and inspection powers. However, there are no binding water quality or stocking density standards even by these well-regulated states. And there are no specific welfare requirements as well. And then we have no regulatory frameworks. In certain states like Madhya Pradesh, Karnataka, Maharashtra, there are limited or no aquaculture-specific regulations. The focus mostly is on fisheries and wild capture. So just to sum up, I'd say that there is, in India, it is one of the largest and most diverse aquaculture sectors, but we are operating within a decentralized and fragmented federal regulatory framework. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rhiddhi. And then last, but certainly not the least, we have Alice talking about EU law.
Thank you, Hira. So I will briefly, again, high-level presentation of animal aquaculture law and dynamics in the EU. I just want to credit my colleague Dr. Gabriela Kubikova, who actually contributed to this research, which you will find in the compendium that Hira is editing. So, quick introduction about what the EU is. I don't want to assume it. So, oftentimes we conflate Europe with the EU. The EU is a semi-international organization. It works as a federal jurisdiction, essentially, and it's a union of 27 countries that we call member states. And under EU constitutional law, the EU is empowered to adopt legislation on aquaculture. I won't dive into the specificities. There are always a lot of fights between member states and the EU as to what the EU can regulate on. But broadly speaking, the EU is empowered to regulate aquaculture. It is estimated that between 500 million and 1.3 billion individual fishes are slaughtered each year in the EU. So I'm really talking about fish. We don't even have numbers for other aquatic animals. As you can tell, it's a pretty broad range in terms of estimate. So, you know, echoing what was said in the previous panel, we don't even really know how many animals, how many fish are killed for food in the EU. And the EU is actually not a major global producer. It's not a major player in the aquaculture market, a global market. The EU generated 4.7 billion in value for a volume of 1 million tons. So those are British tons. They're different from US tons. And the EU's contribution to aquaculture in the world is really limited. It accounts for less than 1% of global production. And in fact, the EU is not even the main producer in Europe. Norway is. Norway is a European country, but it's not a member state. And so the EU imports a lot of aquatic animals, of aquaculture products, and a lot of it comes from Norway. The consumption is relatively high, around 23 kilos per capita in 2023. And the EU primarily imports farmed salmon, mostly from Norway and the UK, and farmed shrimps. But there is some aquaculture production in the EU. It's actually very concentrated. It's concentrated in just 4 EU countries, which are Spain, France, Greece, and Italy. There is really, so aquaculture is very much specialized per countries and per region. So there is a lot of carp farming in Central and Eastern Europe, such as Poland and Czechia, with a very important cultural component to carp consumption in those countries. There is sea bass, sea bream farming in Greece. You also find some of that in Italy, in Malta. And Ireland is the only salmon farming country in the EU, whereas rainbow trout is farmed in as many as 20 EU countries. So it's very diverse, but at the same time very concentrated in terms of types of farming. Now to to talk about aquaculture systems, the EU allows pretty much all common aquaculture systems, marine systems, terrestrial aquaculture systems, and perhaps something that's unique to the EU is that it really champions organic aquaculture. So since 2018, the EU has adopted regulations on quite specific standards, actually organic standards, for commonly farmed fish. And not just fish, actually, aquatic animals, because also bivalves are included in the EU organic standards. I would say the main laws that regulate aquaculture in the EU is first and foremost the 3 regulations that we call the Common Fisheries Policy. It's very confusing because we call a lot of our legislation policies, but they're not actually policies, they're legislation. They're laws. So the Common Fisheries Policy is actually a set of 3 regulations. Those regulations set production standards, and most importantly, they regulate the distribution of subsidies. The EU subsidizes a lot its aquaculture production. And what's interesting, and actually a common theme in EU law, is that there is a mention of animal welfare in the preamble of one of those regulations composing the Common Fisheries Policy, but there's nothing really substantiated that general principle of animal welfare in the regulation itself. So hopefully, that's definitely the goal of animal advocates, to try and substantiate that general obligation in the future. We also have a very detailed organic regulation that's actually regularly updated. The last update took place in 2018. And the EU organic regulation sets animal welfare standards for most commonly farmed aquatic species. It includes salmon, sea bass, sea bream, carps, shrimps, crayfish. The EU actually doesn't produce that many shrimps, but enough that the EU legislature felt compelled to enact organic standards for them, for this type of production. And the standards include maximum stocking density, water quality standards, and again, they're quite specific standards. And in organic production, closed recirculation aquaculture systems are prohibited. Organic aquaculture is far from being perfect, but if it provides the few standards that could very specific standards applicable to aquatic animals in EU law. So often people use it as a model and as a basis to build from for aquatic animals in general in the EU and outside the specific organic industry. Concerning animal welfare statutes, so different from the Common Fisheries Regulation, the Organic Regulation, EU farmed animal welfare statutes include all aquatic animals or vertebrate aquatic animals in their scope. It depends on the statute. But again, there's no specific provisions that's going to substantiate what it means to actually protect the welfare of those animals. And there are no species-specific animal welfare statutes for aquatic animals. And if you want to know more, I've brought some copies of a report we published not too long ago that really details all the protection or all the applicable laws and regulations for fish, farmed fish in the EU. So please don't hesitate to grab a copy later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alice. So with that brief introduction, it was not so brief as a whole, but it was brief individually, we will now move on to our conversation. So I'm just gonna pose some questions, and then we're going to have a conversation, and then we'll finally open it up to the audience. So my first question is, it doesn't seem like hearing all of you talk, and given my own experience in the US, that farmed aquatic animals are really comprehensively protected in any jurisdiction. So what do you think? Why do you think that is? Like, what in your jurisdiction is keeping legislatures from actually passing some kind of comprehensive farmed aquatic animal protection law or reform.
Does anyone want to go first? You go first. Yeah, okay. So I think, well, at least in Brazil, what I see is that three main things. First, aquatic animals are treated by the law as a production unit. So they're seen as production unit. The sanitary risks and environmental risks are addressed from the industry perspective, of course. So that would be the first and probably the main reason behind it. Also, the aquaculture policy, what we do have as a legal framework is a lot more oriented towards growth of the industry, so, and subsidies, and I think Dana mentioned something about subsidies and investment. So it's the framework is developed towards that and not towards animal welfare at all, because it is there's a lot of economic interest in it, and also it is in Brazil it is highly concentrated in one species, which is tilapia. So for the farmers, any animal welfare related progress is seen as a cost and not as something that would be beneficial to them. So it's a combination of economic and institutional factors. We do, as I will keep saying that there is a constitutional principle in Brazil that could be used to say this is, that all the regulatory framework can be adequate to what the Constitution says. It's not something new, it's just adapting what we already have to what the Constitution says. But if you see aquatic animals as just a protection unit, then why would you, right? So that's probably the main reason behind it.
Thank you.
I think what I think would be the main reason in Nigeria would be culture. I think it's just one of those things that are just deeply ingrained in the personal life of many people. And so it makes regulation very difficult, especially because, like, I was listening to your presentation, Alice's, you have such big numbers on how many, even India, how many, the tons, the amount, how much it contributes per capita and things like that. We don't have such numbers at all. So I think because it's not something that is so, I hate to say this, but it's not something that is so important to the government. So legislators don't think it's so important because, like, well, you do your own thing in your house or in your small business life, and we would focus on other more important things. So I think definitely culture and the way, like, the system is already set up is one. Another thing is, I think, a general lack of apathy for, things like animal welfare issues. I think if we were to regulate for, like, import and export, things like that, they may be more interested in just, because it will generate some money. But I think if it's about regulating, like, the farming process and the welfare of the fish in that process, the structure is just set up in such a way that it's easy to ignore, which is unfortunate, really.
Wow.
I can go. So in EU law, I would say a major challenge is the fact that legislation, I mean, it's going to sound weird, but that legislation is science-based, which is great in principle, but it makes the legislature very dependent on science. And not just any science, what I call official science, so science that's produced by independent agencies that the EU uses to inform its policy. Those agencies, I mean, there's one in particular, which is the European Food Safety Agency, that's tasked with providing, the state of the art in terms of what we know in terms of animal welfare science. But EFSA doesn't really know what to do with fish because they don't have enough research. They typically conduct literature review, and then they come up with some sort of recommendations based on what the science says. And when it comes to fish welfare, they just don't have enough research, especially when you compare animal welfare science for aquatic animals compared to what exists for terrestrial animals. They're not really able to come up with strong policy recommendations. Most of the time they will say, oh, we don't know enough. And that's a main driver of why the EU legislator, there are many other drivers, of course, but that's usually what we're told when we ask the EU legislature to adopt standards, is, well, we don't know what those standards should be, and we can only rely on best practices from the industry, which is not necessarily something we want as animal advocates. So that's a bit counterintuitive, but relying so much on the science is actually a challenge for us in the EU.
Super interesting. Rhiddhi, do you wanna?
Yes, for India, I think because we are a LMIC country, I think our challenges are different. I think the political priorities right now are, just increasing production and creating more livelihoods and also nutritional security. A lot of times we see the word welfare being used in policy documents, but it is farmer welfare and not fish welfare or aquatic animal welfare. And I think those are mostly the political challenges that we have. There is a significant, about 50 million livelihoods are dependent on this sector across the value chain. And we have like around 8 to 10 billion rupees of exports that are generated from this sector. So that is something that the government really wants to expand on. And I think that culturally also, I think it's a little difficult, like from an economic perspective, I think welfare improvements are difficult. A lot of our farmers are small farmers or medium-sized farmers, so those improvements are difficult. Also, there's very less consumer awareness about these issues or consumer demand for better farmed or more welfare, fishes or animals that are farmed with welfare in mind. So I think those are the, and also we have a large middle class that is looking at seafood as an aspirational thing to consume. So I think these are the main barriers.
Thank you. Yeah. So kind of on that note, I know my next question is a really big one and probably difficult to answer because it's difficult for me to think of like my wish list. But yeah, in terms of your wish lists, what kind of law and policy reform would you like to see in your jurisdiction, given your individual and of course all our shared contexts? What kind of, and not just necessarily in like the farmed animal protection space, but like just generally in the aquaculture industry, like what kind of law and policy reform would be most useful?
I think I mentioned that in my presentation. Stunning before killing is a very, I think it's a closer win. It's a low-hanging fruit, as you say. So I think it is something that I can see that happening within my lifetime. So that would definitely be something for us to put more efforts on. Not because it is the most important thing, but because it is a long-hanging fruit. It is a win that we can actually achieve. But I also think that seeing animal welfare standards being built into existing regulation, because as animal lawyers, sometimes we fight a lot to create new regulation, new laws, and we could be working more on building animal welfare standards into existing regulations. So environmental licensing should have animal welfare standards. Producers should follow certain standards in order to get the environmental license. And for accessing tax benefits or financing any kind of government support. Like in Brazil, we have the PROAC program, which is a program focused on giving benefits to aquaculture and farmers. They should be following animal welfare standards in order to have access to that money, right? And so this is also, and we don't need to create a separate regulation for that. We can just say, well, existing regulations should follow the Constitution. There is an unconstitutional state of affairs in Brazil, and we should be adapting our current regulations, our current laws to what the Constitution says. And the same goes to having access to federal waters. So if these farms are being built in federal waters under federal domain, and if the federal government has to authorize farmers to build their farms in federal waters, then they should also follow certain animal welfare standards in order to have access to that space. So it seems to me that this is a more reasonable approach. I don't know if reasonable is the right word, but it is. It makes more sense to me that we can we just start talking about how all regulation should follow the Constitution. I don't know. It makes sense to me that it's the right way to go, considering that we have this provision in our Constitution.
I completely agree. And also kind of in the US context, there's in every kind of session of Congress, there's like for the past few sessions at least, there's always been like a bill around aquaculture, right? So there always is like some kind of legislation introduced to try and streamline aquaculture permitting and try and get the agency to be overseen by one specific, the industry to get overseen by one specific agency. But like what's missing is always a discussion of like, or any mention of animal protection or like the animals themselves. And I do think it's like a unique opportunity, like to have that conversation from ground zero, so to speak, right? Mm-hmm. Like at least in the US, and at least when we talk about like the federal aquaculture regime, because as opposed to having animals or thinking of animals as like an afterthought, thinking of them when that system is being established or when that law permitting the industry is being established and the conditioning permits on compliance with animal protection, I think is super important to the extent that if firstly, I don't think it should be, like Claire said, it shouldn't be inevitable that the industry is going to expand, but if it is going to expand, if that's something that the government really does want, then yeah, the animal protection should be a really core part of it, at the very least.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think to answer your question, I'll answer it in two ways. And the first is in terms of policy, and the second is in terms of reform. So in terms of reform, I think what would be number one on my wish list would be more conversations about health implications. I think I've looked at the Nigerian system, and I find that it's these indirect movements that actually lead to real change. And so I think if there were some investment in very serious non-profit groups that are willing to engage people in conversation and actually disseminate information from a health perspective, especially because of some of the dangers that exist for the human health. That link I find is very potent. But then also in terms of policy, and I think what the aquaculture regime can learn is from meat production. So in the way it worked for the meat production is a number of people, including myself, just thought, well, it would forever remain small scale. And, it would always be one of people rearing animals for themselves and things like that. And then just like a couple of small scale farmers, but nothing major. And then we had like $1 billion investment last year, to plant the largest factory farm. And I didn't think that Nigeria could ever house a factory farm. So I think in terms of policy, what I would say is right now, while we have small-scale farming, let's begin to regulate. because I think if we did that for meat production, we may have discouraged the external investors. So if, even if we leave the individuals, the farmers who have businesses and are trading for profit, I think beginning to license these people, begin to train these people, inform them, and actually put some strict regulations, maybe from a health perspective, but even generally welfare speaking. I think starting the number one item on my wish list would be, now that we have a small-scale farming industry without the numbers, we can regulate very seriously and intentionally before we actually have numbers.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So for India, I think we've seen this happen in the fisheries sector, where we had, because fisheries are also state jurisdiction up to 12 nautical miles, the union government did come up with a model fisheries bill, which the states then adopted. And if there is, because we've seen that there's a lot of fragmentation when it comes to aquaculture regulation, if the government, and there have been plans, I think, I remember speaking to an officer 2-3 years back, and there were plans of a model aquaculture bill to be framed, which the states could then adopt. So there was some uniformity. But this aquaculture bill should also, of course, include specific species-specific parameters and welfare standards. The other area, I think, is to bring our domestically consumed aquatic animal products at par with the export market, because right now we see that the coastal aquaculture is better regulated. There are more, I mean, it's more from an environmental standpoint, but there's also water quality requirements, stocking densities, in certain aspects regulated a little bit, but water quality is regulated. There's also certification schemes for called the Shafari scheme, which is like for better aquaculture in coastal regions, which also has some animal welfare mentions. But because this is catering to mostly export market, I think a lot of the domestically consumed animals are being left out, and I think we need to bridge that gap. And lastly, like, we also have terrestrial animal welfare in slaughterhouses. We have rules for that. We have transport of animal rules. I think those need to be amended and updated to include aquatic animals.
Yeah, it would be great to have species-specific standards in EU law for sure, and also, mandatory stunning for all animals, including aquatic animals, when it makes sense. But something that's really been a bit underexplored is also how to leverage, the common fisheries policy. So really that policy that regulates the distribution of subsidies, to also include reporting obligations. Because, so echoing what was said in the panel previously, is we don't even know what's going on. We don't know the practices. We don't really know the numbers. And yet our government subsidizes this industry. So it would be nice to see more reporting obligations, disclosure obligations, to try and figure out how exactly this industry operates. There are also animal welfare. There's actually money under the CFP, under the subsidies regulations in the EU, to promote animal welfare practices, but it's been underused for all sorts of reasons. I won't get into this, but it would be nice to amend those. Also, this measure in particular to actually mandate that member states fund animal welfare measures on aqua farms, because that money exists, but it's not used or it's misused.
Thank you. My next question is, when you hear people talk about aquaculture in your jurisdictions, what do you think is missing from that conversation, or what do you think people were talking about more? Like, I can start, and in the US context, there are a couple of things. Like, one is, there's a lot of conversation around marine offshore aquaculture, and the expansion of aquaculture, and banning the introduction of new species in aquaculture, which is all, I think, super, super important. But aquaculture already does exist to some extent in the US. A few states are really big on aquaculture. And of course, like, state causes of action are also very important and I think sometimes like underexplored tools for combating the harms of any industry. So that's one thing that I'm personally curious about and would want to look into a bit more. And the other thing that I personally would also want to hear more about is aquaculture is framed, like our last panel discussed, as an alternative to terrestrial animal farming. So if not, and certainly more fishing is not an alternative to aquaculture. So if not terrestrial animal farming, if not aquaculture, then what? What is the alternative there? Is it more cultivated seafood? Is it more plant-based alternatives? Is it like what happens if we're closing the aquaculture door as well? What do we direct people towards, or what do we direct consumers towards? I think that's a conversation that I would like to see more.
Yeah, sure. Okay, I'll go.
Yeah.
So I think One Health and One Welfare is one framework where I think more conversations can happen around this topic. We've also seen that there is the recent action plan on antimicrobial resistance 2.0 did include animal welfare in one of its, as an important segment to achieve antimicrobial, like to break away from antimicrobial resistance. And I think that, you know, this health framing is kind of something that can kind of push animal welfare forward. We're also seeing like if there's a way to kind of look at welfare as an investment, you know, and not like a regulatory burden. And if there is a way to get farmers and the government on board to kind of look at it where, you know, sustainability and traceability, if whether it is to kind of improve the health of the citizens or access niche markets, if there, or, you know, also improve the resilience of farms. So maybe to kind of frame that as an investment, an improved infrastructure investment. And also I feel like there's, and I don't have all the answers to this, but how to kind of improve financing in this space for these welfare improvements to be made. You know, because we know that some of the farmers are constantly stuck in this debt and credit cycle. They're always taking loans from the feed companies. So if there is a way to kind of get more philanthropic investment or public and private investment in improving the infrastructure on farms so that there, you know, good management practices and welfare can be safeguarded.
I think that I would like to see us talk more about what's the natural place for animal welfare standards to be, and the answer, I think that the answer should be everywhere. I don't think that the industry has that kind of hesitation. They do think that economic interests should be addressed in every single regulation, and I think that kind of mindset is missing for us. Animal welfare standards the natural place for animal welfare standards should be everywhere. So access to financing, environmental licenses, anything. So anything should be tied to animal welfare standards, and that gives us room to have more conversations with different people with different interests, and instead of, as I said, like creating separate regulation that addresses animal welfare. So animal welfare should be everywhere. Fish and aquatic animal welfare should be everywhere. It should be a covenant in any investor's contract. It should be a standard for any environmental license. And I do think that environmentalists are doing a much better job than the animal protection movement separately. Even though, like, I am saying that animal welfare standards should be in part of the environmental legislation, but environmentalists in general, they are doing a better job at saying sustainable growth should be part of any conversation. So environmental standards should be part of every single contract, every single regulation. And I don't think we are quite there yet. And I think we should be more comfortable with it. I think we should just make it more natural. Like every seed is our seed. Every legislation is potentially an animal protection regulation.
Well said.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think my thought would be a response from outside the country, like from outside Nigeria, because I think I'm not too hopeful about a difference that can be made from inside out. I think it may come from outside in. I think if Nigeria does export some form of some fish, and I think that if the people importing that began to ask questions, I think that may be a call to the government to begin to think, oh, that's true, this needs to be a certain way. And I think part of the problem is the fact that maybe the countries that these fish are being exported to are not, maybe also don't care. Or maybe are not focusing on it at this time. But I think that if we had a situation where there was some international intervention, which could be indirect, I think that is something that could cause some change. And also, I think, based off of what you said, I think fragmented legislation, my thoughts, would be very effective. I think if we even started from just a memo from the Ministry of Health on salmon for pregnant women, I think that alone has such a great impact, because then you begin to think, oh, wow, no more than one portion a week, or at most two. Raising those questions actually get people to start thinking about things like this a bit more seriously. So even if we start with fragments, I think maybe sometime in the future then we can have like what we say is a national act on aquaculture protection. But before then, I think even non-profits can begin to speak up. I don't know of any groups, or even the animal welfare groups that are talking of aquaculture in a way that I think is serious enough.
What I'd like to see more part of the conversation is actually the ethics of eating fish, but it's not very effective, actually, when we talk about protecting fish from an ethical perspective with EU policymakers, also because we can't really substantiate the fact that the public cares. The public cares about public health issues, environmental issues. There's been tremendous work done by animal advocates really on the ground in European countries, in France particularly, to really, oppose the building of intensive aquaculture farms. So people are very sensitized to the issue from very different perspectives, and that's very effective. But in those discussions, and we touched upon that already, people don't really pay attention to the suffering of aquatic animals, because it's probably very challenging for people to understand how those animals feel. I wish it was part of the conversation. But I also realize it's actually not necessarily essential to achieve our objectives. We can, achieve our objectives by leveraging other arguments. But from an animal advocacy perspective, I find that a little regrettable sometimes.
And okay, my final question really quickly before we open it up to the audience is, how can we make farmed aquatic animal welfare part of mainstream aquaculture regulation, such as licensing, water use authorization, basically all the stuff, Paula, that you were talking about, rather than treating it as like some kind of discrete, separate animal law or animal welfare issue, like animals on one side and everything else on the other? How can we make it more integrative? Alice, do you want to take that first? Because you've been going last every time.
Yeah. So sorry. So the question is, how do we regulate things from a more systemic perspective?
Yeah.
Is that it? Okay. It's tough because our laws are not meant to regulate things systemically. So especially in the EU, but maybe that's the case in other jurisdictions. We have the executive branch tends to regulate things sectorally, they call it. It's sectoral regulations, which causes a lot of issues, as you can imagine. But I think typically all the regulations around subsidies, if not there, where? If not in those kind of legislation, where can you actually take a systemic approach to any sort of business activities, really. So that would be the place. And there's already a little bit of that in EU law when, you know, you have some sort of recognition that those policies should take into account animal welfare. So that provision that I showed earlier, it talks about animal welfare. It also talks about food security, you know, environmental protection. So this is already a form of systemic approach. The challenge is, how do you actually translate that? It's actually not that challenging, but when you talk to policymakers, they make it sound complicated. So yeah, at least the challenge for us animal advocates is to convince policymakers to translate this systemic approach in legal text, and with that more general issue of how do you make that happen in a policy-making culture that's very siloed and segmented.
I think I've already talked a little bit about that, but as I said, in Brazil, the federal government already controls access to water, environmental licensing, and access to financing. So even though the regulation is separate for each one of those things, there's a law for the authorization to use federal waters, a law related to environmental licensing, and another piece of legislation related to financing. Even though these are three different regulations, they all have this potential to add animal welfare standards to them. How do we do that? And I think we're shy about it. And when we sit on a table and we say, I don't do government affairs work, just to be clear, I do litigation. It's a whole different thing. But even for litigation, say, we can say things like, why are you financing this? Why are you giving money? Why are you licensing this facility that has this impact? So make it look like, try to build an argument around like, this doesn't make sense. Like, would you finance a facility that uses child labor, right? Child labor doesn't have to be a human rights standard that is explicitly part of that piece of legislation, but everybody understands. Like when you say that, why would the government finance this wine production place that uses child labor, right? And I'm not even, of course, I'm not comparing children to non-human animals. That's not what I'm doing. I'm just saying that the human rights movement did a good job at making this part of the conversation. I think environmentalists are doing a good job at making environmental arguments as part of every single conversation. So I think we need to stop saying, excuse me, can I bring this one little thing? I think we're shy about it. And there's no reason for us to be shy about it. What we're saying matters. And it's bringing ethics to the conversation as part of the conversation, but not just a philosophical conversation. It's just like making a point and not thinking that this is less than anything.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to open it up to the audience for questions. Please feel free to ask questions.
Oh, there's a lot. Okay, I'm going to go to the back. Is this on?
Hello, Tom Appleby from the Blue Marine Foundation, University of the West of England. I just wondered where the place of the certification body sits in all of this, and your reflections on that. I'll leave it there.
I have a lot of reflections on that. Does anyone else want to take it before I?
Independent certification or government certification? Any certification. Again, why aren't animal welfare standards part of the requirements for certification. For organic production, that's pretty, it's more advanced. It's in Brazil, it's pretty similar to the EU. But why are we even certificating farms that don't follow animal welfare standards that are not written anywhere, but there is some scientific consensus on some standards. So why are we even certifying them, right? So I think that's a very smart question. The answer is I don't know, but probably because none of us is sitting on that table.
Yeah, I think that, so at least in the US, which is where I've done certification, kind of research around certifications, I think the entire market is captured by private certifiers. So the government really has no role to play in certifying aquaculture producers at all. Yeah, so the government is basically just completely hands off. And of course, like, I think private environmental governance or private certifiers have an important role to play because at least there are some then standards that producers are being held to. However, I do think it's very problematic for private environmental governance to be the only avenue for certification because, of course, there's, conflicts of interest. There's all sorts of it's completely voluntary. Nobody even has to get certified if they don't want to. And I think that it cannot be a replacement for government regulation. Like at least that's my conclusion, that I think like they're playing a very important role, but I don't think that the government being totally hands off is a good thing because also there's so many certifiers. The USDA organic label, which is kind of the label most associated with like a government in the US, like that is something I think every US consumer understands to some extent what that means. But like the ASC label or the BAP label or Global Gap, like there's so many certifiers in the aquaculture space. Like, do consumers even know what their standards are? Do consumers know what those labels mean? I didn't. I mean, I don't eat fish, but like I don't think I would have even if I did. So I think that's you're leaving a lot on the consumer. It's a big burden to place on a consumer who just wants to like have dinner or just So I do think the government needs to step in and regulate. I don't think private certifiers can replace government regulation.
Hi, thank you all so much for this fantastic panel. My name is Becca Franks. I'm an assistant professor of environmental studies from New York University. So I was really intrigued by your observation, Alice, that the EU requires science to make any kind of moves, that they have to have the science there first. And I'm just curious for all the panelists, I think this sort of gets a little bit to what Paula is talking about, but like, can we make an argument about where the burden of proof should be? So where is the science that shows that these specific operations are going to go to food security? Where is the specific science to show that this is climate friendly? Because if you have a graph that, like what Dana was showing that shows that, fish production is like better climate-wise than pork or beef or something like that, well, which fish, which production system? The details really, really matter. And so like, is there a way that you can like think also of like using the burden of proof to sort of like halt the diversification, because we don't actually have proof for a lot of these systems that they're going to be solving any problems. So I'm just curious how that might play out in any of your jurisdictions. Thanks.
We can try answering. Yes. It's not, I wish it was the way it worked, but it's not the way it works. I think there is a very powerful legal principle that actually would basically make that happen, which is the precautionary approach. So we have that in the EU Constitution. It only applies to environmental issues and public health issues, and it applies to environmental protection, public health, and it's very powerful, and it does work that way, at least in theory, but very much in practice too, for any practices that would endanger the environment and public health. But sadly, it doesn't apply to animal welfare. So this is why the legislature, and understand that this is very political too. I mean, the legislature doesn't have to wait for a scientific opinion to act. It's not the scientists making the law. It's the actually in the EU it's the executive branch, so they could just totally say, oh, we will, implement animal welfare standards for fish, and without having to wait for the science to be, to be translated into official science. So yeah, the goal, I think, and one reform proposal would be to extend that precautionary approach principle to other fields than public health and environmental protection, and to include animal welfare. That would be very helpful for us lawyers and animal advocates, but we're far from there. I think the EU policymakers are not ready for that.
And just very quickly, I do think that public prosecutors, they do play a major role in Brazil, and I've seen public prosecutors file lawsuits to get the government to collect evidence, to do those studies, to conduct those studies, because it cannot be us doing all the science with our limited resources. NGOs, universities, they do their best. We are all doing our best, but the government has resources that we don't. The industry has resources that we don't. And I've seen many public prosecutors stepping in, filing lawsuits and saying, we need data, we need studies, we need to show evidence that this is happening. And so I personally like a lot to work with public prosecutors because they have this institutional weight of being a public prosecutor that we don't. So I do think that it's not direct litigation, but it is a way of doing litigation with the DA's office and with the public prosecutor's office.
So with that, I think we're out of time, but good news is it's lunchtime. So, well, thank you so much, everyone, and thank you to our wonderful panelists.